Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here to listen to my final presentation on Indigenous-specific racism in the BC healthcare system. My name is Brynn Vliet, and I completed my practicum with the First Nations Health Authority's Cultural Safety and Humility team. I started my practicum as the team was just launching in the Vancouver Island region, and I had the opportunity to work alongside the team in creation, review, and development of policies, briefing notes, reports, and other materials related to the framework. Additionally, we work closely with the Island Health Patient Care Quality Office to address the current complaints process. Throughout this presentation, I discuss sensitive topics that may trigger memories of unsafe experiences for Indigenous peoples. Topics include, but are not limited to, the Indian Act, Indian hospitals, residential schools, and colonial violence. As an uninvited visitor, I'd like to acknowledge with gratitude and respect the Coast Salish peoples whose traditional territory I live, learn, and work on. I was born and raised in Port Alberni, BC, on the traditional territories of the Huchasa and T-Shot First Nations. I have been fortunate to work alongside Indigenous community members in several settings. Frequently throughout this process, I question myself, asking, who am I to write about Indigenous racism? As a fourth-generation white settler of English, Dutch, Scottish, and Norwegian descent, I have not personally experienced racism. However, on many occasions, I have witnessed direct and indirect racism towards Indigenous people in my personal and professional life. As a Master of Public Health student and non-Indigenous person, I have a responsibility to acknowledge and address systemic racism and health inequities that Indigenous people face, and to make a commitment to acknowledging, learning, and understanding the harms of colonization. So the purpose of my practicum and final report was to examine historic impacts of racism and colonialism, while also analyzing how it continues to impact Indigenous peoples in BC today. Additionally, I explored what silently normalizes racism and what is needed to eliminate it, creating an equitable, accessible, and safe healthcare system that represents the values, interests, and needs of Indigenous peoples. Colonization and racism have resulted in continued mistrust in the system, institutional avoidance, intergenerational trauma, poor health outcomes, and premature death. It is often seen in processes, policies, practices, conditions, and requirements which reproduce and maintain unfair and avoidable inequities. Indigenous peoples continue to experience vast health disparities, underscoring the importance and urgency of understanding, acknowledging, and addressing racism in the BC healthcare system as a social determinant of health for Indigenous peoples. To understand systemic racism in its current context, we need to reflect on and understand the historic complexity of racism in BC. The main goal of the Indian Act, residential schools, and Indian hospitals was to remove Indigenous governments, ignore Indigenous rights, terminate treaties, and assimilate Indigenous peoples. Indian hospitals set the tone for inadequate healthcare and painted the picture that Indigenous peoples were not worthy of mainstream healthcare services. So today, colonial trauma and oppression takes place within the healthcare system through culturally unsafe and discriminatory care. While Indian hospitals and residential schools have all closed, these institutions continue to impact Indigenous people's life expectancy, well-being, and health. The conditions and illnesses Indigenous peoples disproportionately experience have been connected to the continued effects of the Indian Act, reserve systems, residential schools, and Indian hospitals. Racism and prejudice experienced by Indigenous peoples in BC is due to colonial beliefs and attitudes that Indigenous peoples were savage, dying off, and less worthy. These beliefs have been embedded in policies and laws for over a century and continue to shape public services. Systemic racism manifests across sectors, revealing power imbalances that reinforces discrimination in the healthcare system. Limited credible information, understanding, and knowledge about BC's history adds to ongoing negative social inequities and attitudes. Colonization has undermined and disrupted traditional Indigenous knowledge, health, and wellness practices in BC. In BC, the growth and persistence of Indigenous health inequities signals that we are at a critical public health policy juncture. Current health policies reflect the historic relationship between BC and Indigenous people. So poor health outcomes experienced by Indigenous people have been connected to social determinants of health, which include colonialism, racism, social exclusions, and self-determination. Furthermore, colonialist policies, including the Indian Act, reservation systems, residential schools, and Indian hospitals, are identified as social determinants of health for Indigenous peoples. Health inequities due to colonization are exacerbated by systemic racism in the healthcare system, and disparities are amplified due to the power imbalances. Indigenous peoples have engaged in conversation and have put forward recommendations for positive change in the BC healthcare system. To achieve respectful, equitable relationships that honors and respects Indigenous peoples, the government needs to change the current system. The experiences shared by Indigenous peoples in reports such as the In Plain Sight report must be respected, taken seriously, and turned into real solutions to end racism within the BC healthcare system. So to address Indigenous-specific racism, we must focus on the underlying causes and attack racism at its roots. The current injustices and inequities Indigenous people experience are deeply entrenched in BC's colonial history, and addressing that legacy requires transformative, substantive change. To properly address BC's history of colonialism and racism, we must accept Indigenous people's rights to achieve health, understand the complexity of racism's role, and intimately involve Indigenous peoples in creating solutions. The knowledge, experience, and voices of Indigenous people should lead this work. However, it is essential that non-Indigenous governments, organizations, communities, and individuals take on the burdens and responsibility. Historically, BC has not made space for Indigenous worldviews. Moving forward in a good way involves working together, sharing knowledge, and respecting each other's practices. To create a culturally safe healthcare system free of racism, there needs to be changes in beliefs, behaviors, and systems. So ultimately, systemic change will take place at several junctions. First, we must create opportunities and space to listen, honor, ask permission, while also getting to know each other as well as ourselves. Second, another important step is providing healthcare staff with opportunities to learn about BC's history, challenging beliefs, attitudes, and providing culturally safe care. And third, integrating Indigenous healing practices and approaches into the healthcare system is critical to ensuring the well-being of Indigenous peoples. And these actions align with several calls to action. So cultural safety is an important factor of BC's responsibility and promise to reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. While it is essential, it is not the sole solution for all the challenges and barriers Indigenous peoples face when accessing care. It is important that post-secondary institutions include anti-racism education in the curriculum. It is crucial for healthcare workers to establish an environment where workers feel comfortable to speak up when they witness racist behavior. This can be achieved by creating a no-tolerance commitment against racism in the workplace. Healthcare workers should be held accountable for their actions and inactions, and Indigenous people's concerns about staff need to be taken seriously and investigated. By providing culturally safe training, enforcing a no tolerance for racism, and creating a speaking up environment, we can start to see a healthcare system that does not completely fail Indigenous people. So everyone has a vital role to play when addressing systemic racism and creating change in the BC healthcare system. Public health practitioners and other healthcare staff can play an important role in closing the gap of health inequality through improving access to healthcare by demonstrating knowledge regarding health inequities, recognizing and identifying health issues and concerns, identifying and working with partners to address public health issues, analyzing information and data to determine relevant implications and gaps, applying culturally appropriate and relevant approaches with populations from diverse cultural backgrounds, and advocating for services and policies that protect and promote healthy communities and individuals. As public health workers, we need to collectively create change in the BC healthcare system. So addressing systemic racism requires public health practitioners and allies to educate themselves and other settlers about the urgency and relevance of supporting, understanding, and recognizing the unique needs of Indigenous peoples within the healthcare system. Settlers must acknowledge and understand our current relationship with Indigenous peoples and work towards a relationship built on trust. I encourage public health practitioners to examine their own beliefs, seek culturally safe and trauma-informed care training, build partnerships and relationships with local Indigenous communities and organizations, and advocate with Indigenous peoples for improved Indigenous health equity. Additionally, it is important to regularly ask yourself what role you play and what you can do to build a stronger healthcare system in BC for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So BC is still in the process of transitioning from a colonial legacy of dehumanization, disempowerment, and segregation of Indigenous peoples towards a culturally safe, equitable system that recognizes Indigenous peoples' basic human rights, including access to health services free of profiling and discrimination. To achieve this, beliefs, behaviors, and systems must shift, which requires a human rights focus, anti-racist tools, and mindsets. Colonization and racism have discounted Indigenous peoples' practices and knowledge, reduced humanity, and erased history. Until we confront the past, there will be no justice for those who spent much of their lives institutionalized by the Canadian government. Now is the time to address Indigenous-specific racism, acknowledge past injustices, and move forward with the implementation of long overdue rights for health equity for Indigenous people. I'd like to take this time. I feel very fortunate to have completed my practicum with such an amazing team. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my practicum supervisors, Selita Cook, and mentors, Krista Joseph and Desiree Holmes, who carried this work, have shared knowledge with me, have had difficult conversations with me, guided me, and encouraged me, as well as my MPH cohort and teachers. Congratulations.